listening to the Hour of History podcast with your hosts Stephen Bauman and Matthias Fueling and producer James Abel. The Hour of History podcast aims to understand how we know what we know and why the past matters. Without further delay, your Hour of History begins right now.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we have a special podcast for a couple reasons. First of all, we have a special guest to the side of me. It's not Matthias today, but instead it's Ali Straub, a historian here at Temple University, and we're talking about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, not only because I am going to participate in it soon, but also because Ali has already done it. And what I'm talking about is the Camino de Santiago, the road, the way of St. James. And I think Ali's going to be able to provide some insight, not only for the people who are interested in the history about it, but also for people who might be walking the Camino themselves. So without further ado, welcome, Ali.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me on Hour of History. First-time guest, long-time listener.
Oh, wow.
But I'm excited to do the show. As Steve mentioned, my name is Ali. I'm an environmental historian here at Temple University. My primary focus is 20th century American environmental history. I am a Camino graduate. Pilgrim. But I did a section of the Way of St. James in 2010, which was actually a very special year. It was not only one of the holy years, which is what happens every 5, 6, or 11 years because of random days. But it basically means the St. James's Saint Day falls on a Sunday, so it's which is in July, so it's a kind of a very exciting year. But I also happened to do it on an Easter weekend, so there were a lot of people doing it when I did it.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
First, before we get into the specifics, we should introduce for the listeners and for people who might not know what the Camino is. I'll just give a brief background. This is a lot of it's taken from the American Association, the American Pilgrims on the Camino. So, El Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. It's a pilgrimage to the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, where the legend is that the remains of St. James, who was one of Jesus's apostle, his remains are. So because of this remains, it's been a Christian holy site for the last over 1,000 years. Without getting into too much detail, how did James get into Spain? Coming from the Holy Land, well, he took a boat. And so after being beheaded, his followers carried him and his body to the coast, to Spain, guided by angels, carried by the wind beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that was the Strait of Gibraltar, and to Spain, where eventually he's brought to this town that we now know as Compostela. And that goes, all of this building into the mythology of like the stars, and they follow the stars. Field of Stars is what Compostela means, and it became a pilgrimage site. So Spanish kings used to go there to worship at the site of the body of St. James, and that continued for many years. Do you want to talk a little bit? So is that what appealed to you? And that's just the, far background. There's more background we can develop as we talk about it, but is that what made you want to walk?
It's actually really interesting because I think the Way of St. James and the Camino is really kind of at a cool juncture currently, because it does have this rich kind of history of being this pilgrimage and being very kind of important spiritually, and medieval pilgrims used to just kind of walk out of their houses and make these long journeys to go and see the shrine to St. James. And I think now it has a kind of different meaning for a lot of different people who are now using it for a little bit more of a recreational purposes, which is almost a little blasphemous, but it's okay if I say that as a Christian.
No, I think that's an important insight, and it makes sense in a lot of ways. pilgrimage is different things to different people, right?
Right.
Is that
yeah, absolutely. That's and really that's what appealed to me. I was studying abroad in Spain in 2010, and a couple of friends I had heard about it, and I actually kind of knew about the rich history of it. But I really just wanted to do it to kind of see a part of Spain that I thought might be difficult to see otherwise.
So where did you study abroad?
So I studied abroad in Valencia.
Oh, okay.
On the other side of Spain.
Yeah.
And I took a overnight bus to Madrid and then a second overnight train to a place called Lugo, which is about 100 kilometers from Santiago de Compostela.
Now, after a couple of the more famous kings and influential pilgrims had made the journey, it became a more common journey for commoners, but from all over Europe, so there's multiple routes to Santiago. So can you explain, starting in Lugo, what are you doing?
Right, so that is part of the Camino Francés, which starts in France. But yeah, as you mentioned, I wish we had a map, but there are very variety of different places that you can start. Actually, so are you familiar with the scallop? Yes. So,
I think most of our listeners have seen or eaten. They're delicious.
Oh, yeah. But the Camino scallop, which is kind of the metaphorical, not metaphorical, but it is the image of the Camino, which I actually brought mine.
Oh, all right.
To show you. I was very into the Grateful Dead during this time period, so mine is a tie-dye. But basically it is a large shell with a cross in the middle. It's kind of like a medieval-y looking cross. But anyway, so the shell is actually supposed to represent the different starts. So the various different places you can start on the Camino, but then they all go inward towards the center, which is kind of like all of the pilgrims starting in various different places around Europe and entering the center. Also a fun fact about the scallop shell, which I can give you. So when St. James was being magically flown by various different angels to Spain, it is said, there's actually two versions of this. The first is said that he fell off the boat. His remains were washed away in a really big storm right off the coast of Galicia. And he kind of miraculously was washed upon shore and his body was completely intact and he was covered in these scallop shells. And then another story says that the same thing happened except it was a man on a horse and it was his wedding and he ended up in the ocean and he ended up being fine, covered in scallop shells. So
these are kind of like protective devices, and you wore this around your neck on your backpack. Where did you have this?
I had that right on my backpack. And that's kind of like, just to let people know that I'm doing the Camino and that, I'm being protected. And if I end up, I guess, in falling off a cliff in the water, I will be fine.
So I guess the symbolism, no matter what route you take, as long as you end up in Santiago de Compostela, you've made your proper journey.
Right, absolutely. So the Camino Inglés, the Camino Francés. Was
there a significance? Why did you choose Lugo?
Oh, yeah, just pure where I could get to on a train.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah, which is another thing I think is the very spiritual side of this journey, but also the very kind of practical. But
so this is, the practical is a huge thing, and it's something that historians like to look at. One of the things is next week I'm walking the Camino Inglés, and talk about practicality. The Camino Inglés starts at a different place because guess what? The English pilgrims had to come from a different route. So rather than walk the same route from France across the Pyrenees or whatever, the English would sail down to A Coruña or Ferrol, and they would just walk a much shorter distance. As usual, the English have it easy. And it would be scary for the residents, as you might imagine, when a boatload of English pilgrims just gets out in we're talking medieval towns and saying, all right, we're off to see St. James, and they're like, oh God, I hope they're not going to take him back to London or whatever. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that can take you to Compostela.
Right.
Now I want to continue to focus on your journey. So you take this overnight train. Did you what kind of background, what kind of preparation did you have? Had you watched is this before the famous movie The Way?
This is before the movie.
Whoa, hipster.
This is, and I like to say, I feel like now I kind of consider myself a pretty seasoned hiker. But this was my absolute first foray into anything like this. I had never gone on an overnight, maybe like a car camping trip, but never a trip like this. I had certainly never walked 12 miles a day for 4 days. So this was a little bit of a backpacker, hiker boot camp for me. And I think I really went into it completely blind and not really knowing what to expect.
It's like, oh, this sounds cool.
This sounds cool. I did it with a group of about 5 maybe other people who I actually didn't really know too well, which was also interesting. But yeah, we all kind of got off of that train in the morning and just started walking. But like I said, it's like funny for me to look back on now because I was doing it in these, and I like distinctly remember the sneakers I was doing them in. I was doing them in like Old Navy tennis shoes.
Nice.
That I just would never ever even go on a hike in now.
What time of year was this?
It was April. So as you may know, northern Spain, April. It was raining.
Oh, yeah. And so how did that work with your shoes?
It rained the whole time, Steve. It rained for 4 days straight.
And you escaped hypothermia.
I escaped hypothermia, just barely. I remember by the second day I was walking in like grocery bags tied around my socks and then the shoes over, because I thought that would make me do better than putting the grocery bags over the shoes. But I had one poncho the whole time, a trusty green poncho.
Those things, I don't think they're biodegradable, are they?
I don't think so. But it was great. But yeah, just a lot of rain.
A lot of rain, yeah.
A lot of rain.
And so tell me, when you get off the train, is there just... So I did some preparation and just a couple facts. So in 1985, Spain marked the Camino as sort of this historical site. So on the Camino, they made a pledge that they were going to preserve it and they were going to upkeep it and not change it. That was the goal. In 1993, which was also a holy year, UNESCO made Santiago, the city, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it made the way also a heritage journey or something to that effect. And just so you can get a sort of image of how it has grown. Now, we were saying earlier, Ali's kind of like a hipster because she was doing it before the movie with Emilio Estevez came out and sort of made it really popular in America. But back in 1986, when the Santiago started keeping statistics, there were 2,500 people who walked the Camino. In 1993, by the time it was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's also a holy year, so typically there's bumps in holy year, like Ali was saying, 99,000 walked it. Now you fast forward to 1999, the next holy year, it was 150,000. Wow. And then you fast forward to 2009, 145,000. Wow. 2010, the holy year and subsequent publishing of The Way, 272,000. Wow. And last year, 2017, 300,000. Wow. So from 2,000 to 300,000 people. Wow.
That is an exponentially larger number.
Yeah, so the way I imagine it when I read those numbers is, so Ali's this student in Spain, she's just taken an overnighter, she's in her, her Old Navy sneakers, and she gets off the train and there's just a stream of pilgrims walking to the trail. Is that how it worked?
That's actually exactly what happened. Because I remember waking up on the train and having a conversation with my friend and just being like, we don't have cell phones. We really don't have any information.
Whoa, wait. Let's date ours. 2010.
2010. Well, 2010,
oh, because you're in Europe.
Study abroad. Yeah. I think one of us had like a burner phone that didn't work. But so I remember being very nervous about what's going to happen when we get off this train. Are we going to be able to figure out where we are? Mm-hmm. And then it was like a mass exodus from the train of people just getting onto the Camino and people already on the Camino, just
wow.
pilgrims.
And so just that all these people have gone from southern Spain to Lugo, and then they just and are we talking, so like I know when I studied abroad and I would take a train in Korea to a hiking, in fact where the Olympics are, there's some very beautiful mountains around there. In Korea, when you take the train, people are decked out in hiking gear, like head to toe. Is this what most of the pilgrims look like?
Yes, and I of course immediately felt very shabby in my green poncho and my Old Navy sneakers. But yeah, absolutely. And most people look like, you know, maybe you would look at them and you wouldn't think this was a religious pilgrimage. You would think that we're on the Pacific Crest Trail or something like that. But yeah, I remember it being very early, and I remember just knowing exactly where the trail was, because that's where what everybody was doing.
Followed the herd,
yeah.
And was it so you traveled with a group of 4? Was it like you stuck to yourselves, or was there camaraderie right from the get-go, or did it take a while to develop?
We stuck pretty much to ourselves, pretty much camaraderie in the situation. There was a little bit of we met a lot of people, so there was a lot of kind of like meeting, because there's so many people, meeting people and kind of meeting back up, but we pretty much stuck together the whole time.
And was it so how does that work? What are the dynamics for people that you don't know very well?
Luckily it was a group that kind of very quickly got along, and it was funny because it wasn't really like anybody knew exactly what was going on or what we were doing. So I think that kind of all helped. We all really had to like learn very quickly. But yeah, we ran into a couple snags, for example. As I mentioned, it was really busy, and so on the Camino de Santiago, you will generally stay in what are called albergues, which are hiker hostels. And they could be anything from like a small hostel with, bunk beds to something like when it's a little bit more busy, a town will open up like a gymnasium or something. So on the first day, we just were feeling great. And generally they say, I don't know who they is, probably some guidebook that we
What a historian. Who is they? It's such a historian thing to think about in her subconscious. Anyway, sorry, go.
But generally say, you want to kind of be in one of these hiker hostels by like 3, maybe 3:30, 4 p.m. Because they fill up. 3 p.m. we're feeling great. We want to keep going. So we skipped the safe bet of the albergue in the town we were in, and we just went into the
mountains in the darkness, huh?
Basically into the darkness. And we, by like when it started getting dark, I don't know, 6:30, we were in the middle of nowhere, and we didn't know where the closest town was, and we kind of went into a bit of a panic. We ended up oh my god, I can never tell my mother this. We ended up knocking on we literally knocked on a stranger's door. We refer to it as the night in the inn. But we knocked on a stranger's door, and we kind of I don't know if we knocked on multiple people's doors or if we met somebody in the street and they referred us to somebody who would be nice to us, but we ended up sleeping in their like literal barn.
If ever there were a biblical story.
So there's just 4 of us, and there's this five of us, I guess at this point we had somebody, but there's this very terrifying, not terrifying, but there's this wood burning fire, and so we're warm, but then we're worried we're gonna die of carbon monoxide. But anyway, we made it through that night.
Lived to tell the tale.
Thank you so much to those people that put us up. It was really a great.
So you not only on the road to Compostela, you were guided by the stars. Mm-hmm. You looked up to the stars in the ancient tradition, and then you stayed in a manger. It's just fantastic.
And we all woke up with scallops on our eyes.
No, almost there, right? Okay, wow. So where do you go from there?
Then we learned real quick. We got to the next town that we got, and you go and you go to the towns, and there's information there, and you can get your passport stamped. So we really paid attention to the information. But then we planned out exactly where we were going to stay. We got there early. We got our spot. And then the next day we did the same thing, and we actually ended up, we were on the trail for 2 whole days, so we really treated ourselves to a really nice, like, bed and breakfast.
After 2 whole days, oh wow.
After 2 whole days.
You really labored there.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can't just skip over that as if it's nothing. Anytime there's a hostel or a hiker's hostel or albergue, that's going to be an interesting night.
Right.
So why don't you describe, like, you're exhausted, but you're in, you're not at a 5-star hotel.
Oh yeah, no. We had minimal blankets. Actually, there was a bit of, and then so there was a bit of something happened with it. So basically, there was like one bed, right? So there's one bed, and the rest, it's like not a bed. It's like a weird kind of cot in the corner of the room. And so one person ends up taking the cot, and there's just like a couple of blankets. My friend had what she called a sleep sack, which is something that her mother had sewed together. It's basically a sheet sewed together.
Oh,
and
wow.
her mother would use it to sleep on hotel beds because she was kind of a germaphobe. So we were in the sleep sack. There was 2 other people, I guess, also on the ground who had found blankets, and we're all kind of huddled by this stove that may or may not kill us. And then there's one person who got the cot, and I don't remember how they got the cot.
Wow.
But we wake up the next morning, and we're all it's freezing, pretty much. The stove goes out at night. My friend and I always refer to it as the sleep sack night, when we kind of had to cuddle for dear life. And we wake up the next morning, we're like milling around and getting ready, and the person on the cot had been sleeping on like 9 blankets.
Oh no.
The whole night, yeah. So that was, and I don't remember why we didn't end up with that person. I think that she ended up meeting up with some other friends, but I don't think it was because of that. But yeah, so as I may have alluded to now, I'm a pretty big gear head now. So
is this I'm starting to see everything starting to come together. Is this where it happened, where you learned, I'm never going to go on a hike again and not be prepared?
I think this was a little bit formative in the way that I hike and kind of approach the outdoors and backpacking now.
But this is also pre-history. Did this impact your decision to study environment and...
This actually didn't so much. When I was, so this was in 2010, I was actually studying, I was really interested in Latin American history. Yeah, so that was that. Do you want to hear I don't know, we could go off.
No, totally, yeah, no, we're just chatting.
Why I decided to study environmental history?
Sure.
So that is a different, I can't call it backpacking, but it reminds me a little of the Camino. So anyway, to make a long story short, I was doing my master's program here at Temple. It was the summer after my first year, and I actually did a cross-country bike ride, which was, so I started in Baltimore, ended in San Francisco, and that was like my first real proper outdoors. But anyway, so it was from that I kind of
went to environmental history.
So
is this move for recreation? Is this are you doing this because you're interested in nature, or like what is your relationship with nature? Why are you doing this?
Right, that's a great question. I think like many people who do this kind of recreation in wilderness, it's an interesting relationship, because I think for a lot of years in the United States, in the first half of the first half of the 20th century, a lot of recreation in wilderness was kind of like centered around work. So the precursor of backpacking, I would say, to modern backpacking is something called woodcraft. I always say woodcraft.
No, it sounds better. It sounds more authentic.
But woodcraft, which is essentially where men would go into the woods, and they would bring an axe, and they would bring one fishing hook, and they would just go and live in the woods for a week or 2 weeks.
So Thoreau was a woodcrafter?
Thoreau was he living? He was out living, right?
I mean, he wasn't buying his stuff at the supermarket.
So he was a woodcrafter. Yeah, I guess we could call him.
Or is that like ahistorical, anachronistic?
It might. It's hard to tell, because Thoreau kind of gets pigeonholed a little bit as this great thinker in environmental aesthetic and appreciating the environment for what it is, and he's really kind of almost on the other side, about knowing the environment through in almost like an intellectual aesthetic sense.
So what are woodcrafters taming the environment or owning the environment?
Woodcrafters are taming the environment. They're kind of going out as almost in protest to consumer culture, in protest to urban living, and this is all having to do with changes in the early 20th century.
So to stay with the theme, is that like, I don't know. Well, when you said that, it really clicked with me. Like, our pilgrims is the modern pilgrim, like, you know, so we talked about like the Camino Inglés and this English pilgrim going to see St. James. Is the modern pilgrim like kind of just pushing away modern society and trying to reconnect?
I think in many ways, yes. I mean, why
is that the vibe you got?
That's the vibe I got, yeah, in a lot of ways. And I feel like that's the vibe I get from a lot of, I've done a lot of multiple day hiking, backpacking things, and I feel like that's what I get from a lot of people. And it's interesting to see too, because it's not just you think of, like you said, like hipster, and there's a very kind of cultural aspect of a lot of backpackers and people who do things like the Appalachian Trail. But I found that it's just, a lot of just people I meet in general who are just going out for the weekend, and who live in these kind of areas that I, make special trips and people do make special trips to go to, are just out there doing the same thing. This kind of escape. Yeah,
so they're not quite woodcrafters, but escapists. So let's return to your Camino. We're gonna revisit woodcrafting for sure, because that's interesting and that's something I haven't heard about. And I'm always trying to bring environmental history, or I don't know what you call it. I guess that is environmental history.
Yeah, definitely.
into, because it's a more important thing that we need to get into. Historically, for sure. But okay, so you've walked a couple days. It's pouring rain. I'm curious about the makeup of the people there. Are most of them Americans? Are most of them men? Are most of them women? Who's out there? Who's walking?
And it was really, and I was actually a little bit surprised with how diverse it was. I met someone, a man from France who was by himself, who had been walking it was his like 180th day walking.
Whoa.
I met someone who had been walking for like 5 years. So really kind of like hardcore people that we met. But then we also met people who were just like us, who were just kind of casual Santiago people, and we, all had shoes from Old Navy. But I was really interested, it was really, I think, cool for me to see that and what really stood out for me was the amount of solo women hikers.
Oh, in 2010.
In 2010, yeah, there were a lot of women that I remember meeting who were by themselves, who, for longer periods or shorter periods. And I think that was, again, like formulative in seeing and like women doing this.
And so were they mostly European? Would you walk up to these women and say like what? Why are you here? And like, what went down?
A lot of Europeans, a lot of Spaniards, but then also a lot of French people, who start and do the full thing. Oh, also Buen Camino. Yes, you walk up to someone and say, "Buen Camino, what are you doing here?" But I found, that it was just a really diverse amount of people.
And what was the religious aspect of it? Were there those on the Camino who were like doing the full, I don't know. What was it like? Would most people, would they like, in America, if you ask someone, are you doing this for a religious reason, they tense up and be like, oh, I don't want to say, in America, it's a very tense, like, sort of topic to talk about. When you're walking the Camino, is it a more like... And,
it's interesting to think about, because I feel like I met, people who would just say they were doing it for kind of spiritual purposes, and maybe just leave it at that, which is...
Like, kind of a just... I don't want to talk about that. I'm just here. Is that what it is?
Yeah, just almost like, like you kind of talking about how it's a spiritual purpose. It says volumes in itself, almost, I guess. I didn't really encounter anybody who we talked at length about their
very religion. Interesting.
Yeah, which is interesting, because it is such a deeply kind of religious,
at least rooted in religious tradition.
Right.
And then another one, I have a lot of questions for you, so I appreciate you being here. I think these questions would be formative and useful for almost anyone who's listening. So in the way, in the way.
Yeah.
When they get, they finish their day of walking and they sit down and have dinner and there's like a bunch of bottles of wine and a big feast and there's one guy from Spain, one guy from France, one guy from Germany, one girl from Italy, and then go on. Is it like that?
That was, so that was, not our experience in the first night.
Right.
But actually when we went to the the bed and breakfast, which was our final place, it was like that.
So you have to pay for it.
So you got to pay for it. But yeah, so that was just a really kind of cool group, and it was all for some younger people, but then there was like one older couple, but that was a really diverse group of people there. As far as, and I think I think it all kind of has to do with how you do it. I think if I would have done it, when I did it, I was young, I was kind of with this group, so we were kind of getting to know each other, getting to know other people, but I think if I would have done it by myself, and if I would have done it now, which is 8 years later, I think it would have been a really different experience. But like I said, I think the Camino is super cool because you can get out of it what you want. So I think if that's the kind of experience that you were looking for, then I think you can definitely.
So would you go back again for a different experience?
Oh my God, of course, yeah, totally. I'm honestly, after you said you were doing it, I spent like 2 hours
thinking about how you could do it.
I was like, oh, I could do that.
Yeah. So that's cool. So I think it's important for people to hear as well. The way it's presented in media is like you have to take this like 30 to 40 day journey, but you've taken an abbreviated version. I'm going to walk the Camino Inglés, which is 4 or 5 days. So I'm doing it over spring break. I'm not going to be there for months and months. So what was the alternative? Like, did you get flack for walking the shorter version where people were like, you're not real peregrinos?
You know what? And it's actually interesting because they changed the rule so you get like a cool certificate. And when I did it, you just got the certificate. So we did like 90, very close to 100 kilometers.
Oh, but you didn't actually do the full...
So they changed it, I think, in 2014. So now you only get the cool...
Compostela.
Yeah, if you do over 100 kilometers. But I've never, it just...
but as far as like the other pilgrims, like the ones who were like caked in mud, did they give you the side eye?
I think there was a little side eye, but I think mostly it was just kind of excited to talk to maybe people who were a little bit more fresh. And I've kind of noticed that actually I've done some bits of the Appalachian Trail, and I noticed that whenever I run into, so I'm a section hiker, so whenever I run into a through hiker who's somebody who's doing the whole thing, they're usually like pretty stoked to just be like talking to someone who maybe they haven't seen for the past month and
get some fresh
get some news from outside.
More generally, how does it compare to the Appalachian Trail?
Really different, much more, I don't want to say urban because it's not, but you go through more, towns at some points, at least from my experience, you're kind of walking on the road, whereas the Appalachian Trail is really designed to be very kind of insulated from any of that. So I found that, that's probably the biggest difference, I would say.
And you hiked the Appalachian Trail after. This is post Spain.
This is post, yes. I got better, got all the gear.
And after you get all the gear. So should we go back to the gear, or you feel like if you could get off that train again, what gear would you be decked out in? If you had advice to people who have not yet walked it.
Just a really good rain jacket. I think it rains all the time in Galicia. I think. I don't know. Can you confirm that?
Yeah, it sounds true.
Yeah, so definitely, having a good map, a compass. But again, this kind of brings us back to, I could recommend, things that you could go to kind of REI and go and purchase, or you could get on the climb or something like that. And I think this is really kind of something that in a lot of ways defines how we hike. We as, again, I'm having this historian thing, but as kind of Americans hike, and this reliance on kind of gadgets and stuff like that, but in a lot of ways that was kind of created to leave no trace, which is now kind of the mantra.
Whoa, boom! Before you just blow my mind entirely, let's take that apart for a second. So now we're gonna get history on the Hour of History. Explain.
Okay, so real quick, just kind of going back, right? So let's go back to Woodcroft. So you go to Woodcroft and you bring your axe and you're chopping up the wilderness.
And you're a man at this point.
Oh, I'm totally a man. And I am like a self-reliant, masculine
Sounds good,
man.
Right? Yeah,
man.
okay.
No. Women were like maybe walking around town.
If they were of a certain class, right?
Exactly. But no, so a man would go out, right? Like I said, self-reliance, picking up moss and putting it together and then sleeping on your moss, and there was this kind of whole rhetoric around Woodcroft that really looked down upon any kind of newfangled gadgets and stuff like that. So this is all right, like pre-World War II, and then this kind of continues, and then around the turn of the century you get, not the turn of the century, the mid-century,
post World War II world,
mid-century, you have a lot of kind of discussions like happening about wilderness and wilderness preservation and really what wilderness is.
Let's start there. What is wilderness?
So I think a problem with this question is, what is wilderness? Mm-hmm. It's obviously something that's culturally constructed, but a lot of people who will kind of consider wilderness activists, and this is people as early as like Aldo Leopold, who was started the Wilderness Society, Bennett McKay, Bennett McKay, his last name was McKay, but he was actually had the original idea for the Appalachian Trail. But so these guys are kind of working in the 1930s, 1940s, and taking a lot of the rhetoric of Woodcroft of like, wilderness is not a place. It is, a feeling of self-reliance and kind of stuff like that. So anyway, fast forward a little bit to the early 1960s. There's this push to preserve more wilderness, from post-war timber companies and stuff like that. But a problem is the idea that there's this tension between wilderness, right, which should be preserved, right, from timber, but simultaneously wanting to use it for recreation, right? Mm-hmm. So how can these two kind of ideas exist at once? Wanting to preserve it and wanting to go in with your axe and cutting it down. So it's around this time too that people started doing something else in the wilderness. I mean, they're probably doing other things, but backpack. So this is when we kind of see the emergence of people going in with backpacks who maybe have a little bit more, they have a tent with them, so they don't have to cut down a bunch of trees.
Wow, what a revolution. I was just reading that instead of using briefcases or, backpacks have just taken over. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So anyway, so now you have these, you kind of have Woodcroft and backpacks existing at the same time for a little bit. And then there just is this kind of realization that these wilderness advocates kind of need to square away how we can be, preserving the wilderness while simultaneously using it for recreational purposes. And Woodcroft just didn't really fit in with that. Whereas backpacking fit in great. This idea that you bring more stuff and you leave nature, wilderness, unchanged, untrammeled. And this is this kind of idea of leave no trace. So this really, kind of became the mantra of backpacking, and I think in a lot of ways kind of fit in with this post-war consumer society. And by 1970, like industry, recreational outdoor industry was a $400 million market. So really.
So is it actually creating more of a trace to buy a bunch of stuff to not destroy stuff?
Yes, that's the irony of it. Right, because this Gore-Tex factory or whatever, wherever we're getting these things, yeah, absolutely. And really that's a theme of environmental history, is just kind of moving environmental costs to different places,
different things. Yeah. And so now the whole time you're explaining this, I just have this image in my mind of like a medieval pilgrim. And so a medieval pilgrim, might have their like one outfit, and they probably smell terrible. Gosh, we don't think about what medieval times smelled like. But they go from town to town, and then they might rely on the kindness of the town, much like you did, to survive, but they would leave very little trace. They might leave a marker that said, if especially if you're an important medieval pilgrim and you're from England, you're going to leave a marker that says so and so from England was here. But you're not going to leave much of a trace environmentally. What did you notice, or what would you imagine is the trace that all these pilgrims, these 300,000 in 2017, are leaving across northern Spain?
Right, they're probably leaving a trace. Oh yeah, I imagine just that volume of people. And there's like a couple different ways you could look at it. They're leaving an economic trace, which is probably really good for these small towns, right? Paying, to stay in albergues, to eat at the local diner and stuff like that. But they're probably also leaving an environmental trace. This is it's a single, pretty much trail.
What was that like? Is the trail like it's a well-trodden path, or are you making an imprint on something that would otherwise be nature?
So it's a well-trodden path, I would say. But I think that even in well-trodden paths, that volume of people can cause erosion and trash and horsing around.
Did you steal apples from local farms?
But there were a lot of sheep, and I remember we were thinking if we got really desperate, we would just shear a sheep and sleep under its wall. But again, so I think that's a really good kind of thing to think about when thinking about the Camino, because it is this trail, this man-made, man-conceptualized trail, but it's also natural. And I think that this is a great example of a really important thing in environmental history, which is this kind of blending of nature and culture. And I don't really think that they can be untwined.
Unintertwined. Yeah, well, I'll accept that. So then we have the Camino. So it's a mix of this man-made trail. It's also what people are using to escape the man-made city. It's a trail that has its roots in religious, basically religious action, and yet at the same time people are going there to find a new path. So a lot of things are happening at the Camino at one time. When you go from the trail and get to Santiago, is there what is that like? Is it we're done and now we've arrived? How's that mixture?
It was we've arrived.
After
But it is. There's a lot of really, it's a lot. It's a lot of you go from natural to this built city. Santiago is a very kind of populated urban environment, so there's just these kind of stark differences, I guess. You go from being not really knowing so much where you are for 4 days, and then again going into this well-established place. I'm thinking about the cathedral. You kind of go there, and there's certain checkpoints, and you get your pass, and then they kind of send you on your way. So really different stark contrasts, I guess.
So the whole path is it's a meeting and contrast, and we kind of find these things throughout history when we're looking into different issues. We also find this in what do you think? I wanted to ask about the symbols and the sort of the way that the Camino is kind of packaged versus, say, something like the Appalachian Trail. You're active, I know, in hiking in the United States. Is there something the United States could do better, or is there something the Camino is doing really well? What's the next step for hikers? Making hikers more hikers.
More hikers. We want
making hiking great again.
We want less hikers.
Is this exactly the problem?
And I think that might be the problem. Is hikers generally want less hikers. So
is that fair to say about pilgrims too? Would pilgrims like a more solitude?
And this really gets at that tension between wilderness and recreation, because even as so I'm a hiker, did the Camino, I think it would be great if they were, more albergues along the trail available for hikers. Or if, when I did it in 2010, if there was a little bit more of like infrastructure in terms of like maps, like the Appalachian Trail has like maps everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I want less people to do it, which is like a very selfish kind of thing. But in order to get these kind of, build up infrastructure and keep things well maintained, you need interest in them. So you need more people to do it. So again, it's this catch-22 almost.
Yeah.
And I don't really know how, wilderness advocates did a good job with Leave No Trace of kind of figuring out how to do this.
To people.
Yeah, but I guess the only answer would be to have more wilderness.
And to do that, we'd have to create it. No.
Right, exactly.
So what is I wanted to ask about authenticity, and you can take this both in hiking and in your Camino experience, or even environmental history. How far out of a city do you have to get to be outside, to be in nature, or was there a lot of that on the Camino, like search for authenticity?
I a little bit feel that sometimes when I'm on the Appalachian Trail, like search for authenticity, or even when I'm hiking around Philadelphia or something like that. But I never really felt like that on the Camino. And I think that's because I went in with such, I don't want to say low expectations, I just want to say no expectations, of really not knowing what I was looking for, and maybe not having such a clear sense of, what I think, despite the fact that I know it's man-made and created and culture is natural, but what I think is natural. I had a friend when I was living in Omaha, and we used to get together and go hiking in Iowa, and he would always text me and say, do you want to go out to Iowa and take a walk? And it was weird. It was like very weird that he would say that, because like I'm like, I don't want to go take a walk with you, but we would always go to the state parks and we would go hiking, and he would always tell me like, no, I don't like to use the term hiking. Like I think, he's like, we're just walking, and we always would have debates about, well, it's creepy when you text me, do you want to go take a walk in Iowa?
It's just a walk in the woods.
It's just a walk in the woods, exactly.
Interesting.
And I think again that gets at how the fact that a lot of these things that we do think of as natural are just, in a lot of ways culturally created.
Yeah, and so is the search for authenticity futile, or it's whatever you make? And I guess what you're saying is that it's all about the expectations.
It's about your expectations, right? And it's about, if you kind of, now that I live in Philadelphia, if I want nature, I can go to Clark Park and I can be happy.
And does that counts?
And that counts for me, because you live in Philadelphia.
No, I understand. In fact, I am a self-proclaimed birder, and
yeah.
I was just the other day looking out my front window and I saw robins. And I remember when the first time I saw a robin, I was like, that is the coolest bird, just because that was the easiest to identify. So I didn't really know other birds, but I was like, I know that one. I'm going to watch it for a while. And then the same sort of thing happens when you go out and there's these birders who are just trying to get their number count up higher, and they're just like, have you gotten that rose-crested grosbeak? And I'm just like, no, I'm just trying to have fun, man.
Yeah.
Just let me have fun.
No, trying to look at birds.
It's all very interesting and all very relevant. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up, something special about, I don't know, environmental history or the Camino, or some sort of final thought you have on the experience?
You know what? I wish you the best. Just really enjoy it. And know that there is somebody who wishes they were. There's probably a lot of people who wish they were there also. It was a great experience, and I think you can kind of make it a great experience, and just really, again, bring a rain jacket. Maybe like a galosh, a slicker, a parka, I don't know, any of these things I think would be really helpful. But yeah, Buen Camino, don't forget to say it to everyone you meet, because that's actually the best part of the Camino. Buen Camino.
Buen Camino.
And you have to say it like that.
Oh, I will have no problem with that. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Ali.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on Hour of History. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and at 48 minutes, that's your Hour of History.